World Bank, so I'm basically the child or the poster child of a multilateralism. I'm currently working as an institution specialist. So if you're thinking about a career in the international relations, that's something that you can explore. You can learn about policies and institutions and how they can interact. I used to be the climate finance advisor for the Partnership of Governance Reform. So if you're thinking about environment, climate, that's also a sector that you'd like probably to be in. So allow me to introduce the topic. We have heard today, this morning, that there has been a debate on liberal international order, whether it will survive. And it's basically defined very loosely as a rule-based international order and governance that is currently led by the U.S. We see how U.S. and its economic, military supremacy has managed to lead the international order. We see that institutions, multilateral institutions such as the UN, Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF or WTO, are there to help United States to promote liberal values that they believe in. However, we see that U.S. leadership has declined, as we have heard as well this morning. We see that number of foreign aid coming from the U.S. has significantly declined. Their support for international organizations, including UN organizations, have declined. There's also increasing preference for bilateral trade agreement rather than multilateral trade agreement. That is also apparent. And if you Google the U.S. pulls out or the U.S. is pulling out, you can do that at the moment. You can see that they're pulling out from a lot of things, Paris Agreement being one of them. Okay, now let me ask you a question. Did you hear about President Jokowi's speech in the latest or in the last World Bank IMF annual meetings? What did he say? Winter is coming. Any of you watch Game of Thrones by a show of hands? Are you old enough to watch Game of Thrones, by the way? Do you believe that winter is coming? Yes? No? Anyone who believes that winter is coming? We are in a tropical country. I don't know why winter is coming. But with that, let me introduce our distinguished esteemed panelists for today. The first is Professor Amitav Acharya. He is a distinguished professor of international relations, a prolific author as well at American University. And second, we have Nicolas Tenzer. He's the chair of the Center for Study and Research on Political Decision in France. And we also have Dr. Joseph Chinyong Liow, who's the Dean of Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU. And last but not least, we have Kotaro Tamura, Asia Fellow of the Milken Institute. So let me explain how the panel is going to work. I will give the panel a general question. So I'll give you like 2 minutes each. 3 minutes each, and then can you hear me? Can we do something about the echo? So I'll give, I'll give you 3 minutes to speak generally about multilateralism of international order, and then I'll give you another follow-up question, if that's all right. I'll follow up from your... All right, so the first question, I guess, for the panels, these are the general questions. So what do you think of international order? What is the makeup? Has it changed? Will it survive the current situation, basically? So starting from you, Professor.
Thank you very much. I'm a little unprepared for this because I had 7 minutes, I thought. And also this morning session has been so overpowering and so brilliantly executed that my head is still reeling from all those things we learned this morning about Indonesian diplomacy and all the conflicts and the cooperation happening in the world. So the liberal order, unraveling of the liberal order. I should start by saying that in 2014, well before anybody thought Donald Trump will run for the US presidency in any serious way, I had been thinking about the liberal order. I wrote a book written in 2013, published in 2014, called The End of American World Order. And that's the second edition of this book. But the first edition was published in 2014. And in the back of the book, I said the liberal order is coming to an end. Whether or not United States is declining or not, the order that it built, meaning the global or international order it built, which we call the liberal international order, is coming to an end. Now, obviously, very few people those days paid attention to that, but after the election of Trump, everybody is talking about the crisis and decline of the liberal order. Now, one of the questions that we were asked to address in this panel is what is the liberal order? And I think as an academic, it's probably my comparative advantage to talk conceptually and say what it is that ending or in crisis, because this is a term that is used interchangeably with multilateralism, interchangeably with international institutions in general, and also with American primacy or dominance in world affairs. So very quickly, there are two meanings of the liberal order that you find very kind of mixed up, confused, or conflated in the media and also in academic writings. In the very broad sense, it's the order based around a series of multilateral institutions which were created during and after the Second World War, such as the UN system, IMF, World Bank, and also along with that is a system of free trade and liberal values. Some people call it rule-based order, but those rules are the rules of these multilateral institutions. Although skeptics might ask who created those rules. Rule-based international order sometimes can beg the question, whose rules are we talking about? But I am talking about the rules that we associate with multilateral institutions. But there is a narrower but a more consequential meaning of the liberal order, which associates it with American hegemony or American dominance. So it's not just a liberal international order, it's the American-led liberal hegemonic order. In the academic writings, that's the concept popularized by a friend of mine, John Eikenberry from Princeton. That's what we engage, and that's the thing that I engage in my book. So if somebody asks you what is in crisis, what is in ending, I don't think liberal principles and institutions are ending. Some of them are in crisis, but they're not ending. But the idea of a liberal hegemony, with United States calling the shots the way it did after Second World War, that is ending. And very quickly, one more point. Donald Trump is not the cause of this crisis in the liberal order. I wrote my book well before Trump was a candidate. Trump has nothing to do with the crisis, the origins of the crisis. He is the consequence, or rather than the cause of the crisis in liberal order. He was able to exploit the decline of that order and its consequences. For example, globalization, the free trade, even international institutions. He was able to persuade a section of the American public that these institutions and the idea, the globalization, the dynamic has not been good for the United States. Now, he is, of course, not the only one, and there are also many Americans who challenge, who don't believe that, but he was able to play the electoral politics and to convince a lot of American voters that that's the case. So what Trump is doing, once he becomes president, he's pushing the liberal order over the edge, but he did not start the crisis. And one final point, while the liberal order was unraveling, the liberals themselves were sleeping. They paid very little attention to some of the long-term consequences of globalization, free trade, and also the fragmentation of the international institutions built after World War II. Because people are very kind of lulled into some sort of complacency because of President Obama, who was an internationalist. And the liberals had expected, much of the world had expected, that Obama will be succeeded by Hillary Clinton, and she will continue the same liberal internationalist foreign policy. So the liberals paid very little attention to the unraveling of the liberal order, and now they are unprepared for its consequences. All of a sudden, everybody is talking about the liberal order being over or in crisis. So I will stop here, and later on I will address one of the points if I get a chance. What might replace the liberal order? Can it come back? Or we should prepare to go where no one has gone before?
All right, but Nicolas, perhaps you can also answer more or less on the same question. Can it survive? And perhaps since you come from Europe, can Europe actually replace United States in the global leadership?
Thank you very much. I think when we have to talk about the liberal order, we have really to understand what it means to be a liberal today. Basically, I think that liberalism is a very inclusive principle that must have a value both at home and abroad. And we cannot make any distinctions between liberal order on the world stage and liberal principles, in any countries. What's the true threat to liberal order? In my view, the true threat to liberal order is that you have some countries who just want to break down the rule of law and to delegitimize the very principle of the rules-based order, such as humanitarian law, such as the compliance with international agreement, such as the pacific resolve of disputes, and of course the very principles of multilateralism. You know, there were a time, it was 1992, you had Fukuyama talking about the end of the story, the end of history. Because he said at that time, and then revised his own position, it was fair enough to do that finally there is only one dominant principle, which is liberalism. But when we are seeing what's happening in the world right now, such for instance the war crimes committed in Syria by both Assad regime, Russia and Iran, if you see the war crimes committed by Saudi Arabia in Yemen, if you see the war crimes committed by Myanmar army against the Rohingya, you see very concretely that there is an attempt, which is not only a military attempt, but also an ideological attempt to break down the liberal principles that we were standing for. And in fact, if there is a divide, it's still between liberalism and something else, not between liberalism and communism anymore. But you still have this divide in the world. And then you have also some big countries, including Trump's America, who is saying right now that the US will not abide to the very principles of, let's say, criminal law, the protection of the environment with the Paris Agreement, and some of the very principles that are guiding up to now the international stage. And in a way, the US, who was supposed to be the protector of the world order, is just saying, I don't care, because I prefer to have my own transactional relationships with each country to broker the deals without any vision of a kind of ideal. And from this point of view, you have all the rock states, all the rock powers, including Russia, who say, well, okay, we will approach. Because there is no big power trying to fix the world order. And you see what happened at the UN Security Council. You have, about Syria, 12 vetoes. You, from Russia, you had 6 vetoes. From China. And people say, okay, the UN is dead. And then you have also the US just saying right now, well, we can also, we are not tied by the principles at the world level. So I think what could happen right now, first of all, I think there is a hope, and those are 2 hopes mainly. First of all, there is a hope coming from the civil society. I think you have the civil society in many countries who are standing for the very rights of the people, for human rights, for the liberalism, whatever the religion. Then when we are talking about human rights, I think that human rights is not a Western thing. That's not a Western principle. There could be no relativism about human rights. Because I see in all the countries, could be Muslim countries, could be Arabic countries, could be Confucian countries, could be African countries, many people, human rights fighters, human rights defenders, civil society groups, standing for human rights. So no government would say there is a relativism about the liberal principle and the human rights. Because you have people. So it's not theoretical, but that's something very concrete. Because you have people in all the countries, whatever the religion of the people, standing for those rights. And I think that's a hope. And this hope is coming from the people, from the civil society, because of the empowerment of the people. And of course we can say that the social media, the social networks are a threat. But that's also a hope. Because everywhere in the world, you have those fighters, and those fighters, I think, are the true face of humanity today. And there is a still role, and that's my last word, for what I would call the medium Greek powers, or Greek medium powers, such as Indonesia, such as my own country, France, such probably Germany and many others. I think those countries, probably more than China, the US, and certainly Russia, could be the true protectors of the new world order. Those countries, we have to expect from your country, from my country, a lot, because of the pledge that we have for multilateralism. And I think that's probably a progress, a sign of progress of the world, that those countries, like mine and yours, are standing together to enshrine this principle in the real world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go to ASEAN, and we'll probably pick up from either the human rights or the economic point of view. ASEAN is currently at a hotspot when we talk about human rights. But Dr. Joseph, where does ASEAN stand in this international liberal order?
Well, as far as ASEAN is concerned, I think we have very much been a part of this liberal international order. And we have benefited from it, and because of that, I think there is concern. First and foremost, ASEAN, as far as ASEAN, the organization and the leadership of the countries are concerned, they don't really talk about a liberal international order. Okay, we have to get that straight. I myself have problems with the concept, because the liberal international order was neither liberal nor international nor orderly, right? But we can talk about that separately. Second, when ASEAN looks at this notion of the international order, one of the priorities has always been the institutions governing trade, and that was something that has always been very central. And that has been a cause for concern, which is why ASEAN is very much intent on ensuring at least the region is moving ahead with its own approach. So you have things like the RCEP, you have things like the reformed TPP. What is interesting in both instances is, of course, the United States, which we understand to be the anchor and the architect of this so-called liberal international order, is absent from both these institutions, which then leads to the question of whether we are looking, at least in our region, the emergence of a regional order that may not necessarily be dependent on this larger nebulous liberal international order, right? So we're looking at perhaps the emergence of more prominence given to regional ways of thinking about global affairs.
Thank you. So, Dr. Kotaro, my question for you would be perhaps on Asia more broadly. Dr. Joseph has said that ASEAN should not depend on this broader international order, but the world is now looking at Asia because we're now the drivers of economic growth. China is now growing, and India are growing more assertive in global leadership. So what do you think is the role of Asia in this new configuration, so to speak?
Well, I think Asia will be more important, and Asia is the most important part of the world, at least economically, at least right now. It's a center of the gravity of the economic growth, and will be the largest region in terms of GDP and population already, and soon will be more. So 2030, the ASEAN plus India, China, and other Northeastern Asia countries' population will be 5 billion. So 5 billion is the total population of the planet 20 years ago. So that will be massive. As going back to your basic question, multipolar system will be surviving or not. It's, predicting the future is very difficult. It depends. And, we can learn from history, but at the same time, we are not living in the past. And the future is very different. And the recent development of the economy, GDP, technology, and our lifespan, we're living longer. And the rise of the technology companies is not comparable to even 10 years ago, 5 years ago. We shouldn't underestimate power of the players such as Facebook, Google, Apple, Palantir, or Alibaba, Tencent, Tokopedia probably, and Gojek. So, technology companies, in a sense, is responding to the people's wish and desire more accurately, more extensively, rather than by the nation state. So it will be very complex. So how do we see the future? I think future cannot be analyzed. Not like future can be analyzed, not like black and white. We have to be prepared for several scenarios and put the probability on the several scenario. I think that's a very realistic way of foreseeing the future. I think, allow me to touch upon my bottom line. I quickly share my bottom line. Best case scenario, probably, allow me to be very realistic. I don't talk about wish. Allow me to talk about reality, what I see in the future. I think future reality, of course, G20, G7, such platforms like G20, G7, ASEAN, EU, or United Nations will survive. And everyone's voice will be heard to some extent. But mainstream world order decision making probably done by two big body, China and the US. And probably the best scenario is China will be more advanced. Rising China change their way of thinking concerning to the human rights or people's freedom of everything, and rise of the Chinese citizen, like the Maslow's of 6-step theory. So the more you get wealthier, most important thing is self-decision making. So Chinese people, as they get richer, they probably will be changing. I'm not saying democracy will be there, but even though democracy is not there, the way of thinking the Chinese leadership and Chinese citizens toward the responsibility to the world will be changing, and the gap between Western way of taking care of the liberalism and the Chinese way of that will be narrowed down. That's the best scenario. The worst case scenario for me, according to my analysis, will be China will be more controlling throughout technologies and cyberspace and economic power, probably military might, and try to control everybody like controlling their citizens right now. Probably the reality in the future will be in between so-called G2 in the best case scenario, G1 done by China. So my sense will be something somewhere between that the best scenario and worst case scenario.
Okay, thank you. We will have time for questions. But before that, let me ask Professor Acharya, do you think that there's this trust against liberal values, liberal international order is because globalization has not benefited everyone equally?
I think that's part of the answer. Globalization has, the impact of globalization is uneven. Globalization, as we have known for a long time, produces winners and losers. But I think there is something more going on. We don't blame it all on globalization. And that goes back to the whole idea of liberal order. The liberal order was never really a global order. It was a club of the West. I mean, that's one of the things I talk about in my book, the myth of the global order. It was basically United States, the Western European countries, maybe Japan and Australia, but I don't think India, China, much of Africa, Indonesia were part of the liberal order during the Cold War at least. So they didn't have the same stake in this framework of liberal order. They benefited from it to varying degrees. China is the biggest beneficiary of the liberal order. Russia is the least beneficiary of the liberal order. So they have very different attitudes, even though they are all part of the BRICS. So also the scenarios about the future that our colleague talked about, G2 will be a disaster for the world, and G1 will be also a disaster for the world. I talk about G+, not G1, not G2, not G7, not G20, G+. Where G+ is happening, and this is one thing that are happening around us can tell you. What we heard today will tell you. The world is no longer dominated by one power, two powers, or superpowers or great powers. Some people think the end of unipolarity or the American dominance means multipolarity. Multipolarity means having several powers. And an assumption that goes with it is that we are going back to Europe before 1945. Because multipolarity has a historical baggage. It was Europe before 1945. Now, if you look today, and in a multipolarity, just to add, the main actors are the great powers, the big powers, and the superpowers, but also big powers. Now, if you look at the world today, it's very different. The number of actors are huge, including multinational corporations, including non-state actors. People empowered by social media can have a lot of influence, but also at the different levels of action. Action happens at the UN level. Indonesia becomes the non-permanent member of the Security Council. We'll see action at that level. But Indonesia has seen a lot of action at the level of ASEAN. So if you look at where conflict and cooperation is being produced, it's not necessarily only at the global level. So we had the two Koreas, the ambassadors. I don't think Mr. Trump would have had the window to play his diplomacy with North Korea if the two Koreas did not come together first. The action is actually at that level to begin with. Who is making the difference between conflict and stability in the Middle East? Well, you can say US and Russians, but also the Turks and the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Israelis. The regional powers have a and Iranians, huge impact on what happens in the Middle East. And in the European Union, can you say it's only the US and the Chinese and Russians? No, the European Union is the most important actor in Europe and could become even more important as the United States distances itself from the European Union. So this world is not a multipolar world. Multipolarity is only one dimension, distribution of power among 5-6 countries. But there is a lot more going on in the world at the regional level, at the level of non-state actors, at the level of also not just geopolitics, but trade. And this is going to be a very complex world, which we have not seen before. This is I call a multiplex world because multiple actors, multiple levels of governance, but complexity, multiple complexities. And there is also hope in here. One of the nice things about this meeting, by the way, and you are lucky, because if you go to a meeting in Europe like this, there are very few meetings that are catered to the young generation.
Right.
You will come back depressed and in tears, so there's no hope in the world. We actually saw that there is a bit of hope in the world. And that is true.
Professor, I will have to pick up from there. I hope we are an optimistic group of people. So we will have time for questions. Raise your hand. Okay, we have, oh no female in the group. I will give the first opportunity to you, Bapa. Second, you're the first. Okay, one lady over there with glasses.
Thank you very much. My name is Nirma. I'm associated with the UNDP as well as teaching in some universities here. I would like to pose a question, comment and pose a question to Professor Amitav's point, basically about multiplexity. I mean, you mentioned that basically, I think from what I gathered from your intervention is that the world will be colored mostly by the return of nationalism, that people will be looking into their own national interests. And the more, the most that they can actually engage in some internationalism is probably regionalism, which is their immediate neighborhood. Then the question is that what then will happen internationally? I mean, we have all these liberal institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN, and a lot of other things, and a lot of mechanisms at the global level. I mean, what will happen to these mechanisms? Will it become irrelevant that countries are abandoning all the multilateralism altogether and return to nationalism and perhaps the most regionalism? Or is there something that is going to be made up into something else? And I agree with Professor Liow, my dear friend Joseph, point that we have to really pinpoint what is meant by liberal international order. because in this part of the world and in this country, liberalism is often viewed in a dirty L word and everything. So this is something. So if there is something that is going to replace that, what will it be?
Thank you, Pak. Thank you. So the question is basically what happens to international organizations, including UNDP and World Bank, perhaps, yeah, Pak. What happens and what will stand in its place, and will regionalism or others will replace that? Second question, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your opportunity. My name is Arjuna. I'm working at law firm as a young lawyer. Thank you for the presentation from panels. It will be great for us as a youngest generation. My question is, in perspective of the gap between developing countries and developed countries. This is the big gap. This is the big gap. In the United Nations, mostly developing countries have power instead of developed countries. Like in history, Indonesia is a pioneer in 1955 for ASEAN Africa movement. That's our dignity as a country. And all of you from developing countries, but Indonesia, like Mr. Jokowi Widodo started to playful in the high level in like IMF before in Bali. As your expertise in your experience, what have to do for developed countries to minimize the gap between there and the developing countries? For instance, in business or legal or like judicial system. Like I'm a lawyer, I know that we have two legal systems, common law and civil law. We have many diverse values in law.
Thank you.
That's my question.
So the question is how to minimize the gap, and how can the existing or the future order can help minimize that gap. One more question. The girl all the way to the back. Do we have a question from over here?
I have a question to Professor Amitav. Thank you. Firstly, thank you for your presentation. I do enjoy it. But I just have a question about the South China Sea issues, because you just mentioned a lot of issues, but where the regional level play an important role. But coming to the recent development in the South China Sea issues, it can be seen that it seems to the game of big power only. We can see like China, he does whatever he wants to do, no matter what happens in some multilateral mechanism, no matter what is happening to the international law. So in your opinion, do you think that is there any space in that issues that the multilateral or regional level can jump in and have their own voice? Thank you.
So I guess the question is regarding to what you said about compliance to agreements and the order itself. Countries such as China or other countries are trying to, make a way around it. So how do we deal with that? One more question here. You may come forward. Oh, okay. The microphone is coming to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is S.Rajaratnam from Gambia at the University of Jakarta. I'm an international relations student, and my question goes to Professor Amitav. And you talk about multi-complexity. To my own understanding, meaning people are shifting from the liberal club that you talk about is a Western club. So, to your assumptions or from any of the panels, what are we looking forward to concerning these multi-complexities in the international system? Is it going to be based on bilateral agreements, or is it going to be even out of the control of states, but more of non-state actors? Because as of now, the international order is based on state-to-state dealing, and the complexity is going forward, including non-state actors. Is this what we are looking for, more of bilateralism than more of looking forward to only main powers? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I will ask Professor Amitav Acharya to explain and to respond to questions on multi-complexity, rising emergence of non-state actors, and what happens after. Perhaps Nicolas Tenzer on the compliance to international agreements, and Kotaro and Dr. Joseph on how to minimize the gap between developing and developed countries, and perhaps there was also an issue of the South China Sea.
I recognize my friend Amurwanti and his question about what happens to international organizations and regionalism. So many of us didn't probably see this on a day-to-day basis, but well before President Trump, the big multilateral organizations that constitute the UN system were gradually but steadily losing their monopoly over issue areas. In the 1940s and 50s, the international cooperation was mainly driven by big multilaterals, so IMF, World Bank, the UN system. But steadily, we have a growth of parallel, complementing and competing institutions. Some of them are regional, European Union, ASEAN, African Union, and the OAS, and the like. Their role is not challenging but complementing, but nonetheless, they carve out some space for themselves where they would not they would want to be the primary actors in that space. But there are also non-state actors, which have been social movements, which have really made their influence felt in many issues: peace, disarmament, development, and the like. And then there are also, more recently, since the rise of China, we have seen the rise of parallel institutions, like the new development bank of the BRICS. Also, we have institutions at the regional level, the Chiang Mai process, China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is, again, they're not necessarily challenging the IMF or global institutions, but they still have, they're picking up gaps where the big institutions cannot fulfill their mandate or perform credibly. So the IMF did a very poor job of the 1997 financial crisis, and no country knows this better than Indonesia. Then we had the Chiang Mai process. The 2008 economic crisis, the IMF also did not do a credible job. And the United States Senate did not ratify the reform of IMF, the bill. So China decided to go ahead and create the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So this fragmentation, pluralization, you cannot talk about global health today without the Gates Foundation's role. It's not just a World Health Organization. So this fragmentation and decentralization of international governance is going on for a long time. And that's going to continue. And I think generally it's a good thing, as long as it doesn't do away with the original organizations. But the original organizations also need to change. I mean, there are some anachronistic practices, like having an American as the head of World Bank all the time, or French as the head of IMF. Forgive me for saying that, but it's anachronism. I mean, why can't a Chinese become the head of IMF? So I think we need to do that. But I don't think multilateralism is going to be dead. Trump or no Trump. Other countries will pick up the Paris Peace Agreement, Paris Climate Change Agreement, a tremendous accomplishment for the multilateral system. Even though the United States under Trump doesn't support it, American corporations and American cities will support. So the European Union leads when it comes to climate change. Leadership will be also divided, shared. Rather, like China will have a big say over the global economic and development cooperation mechanism. United States will continue to have a major role in global security management. European Union will be a very powerful actor when it comes to climate change and social issues. So we are going to see that kind of a complexity which will keep the space for multilateral organizations, but not of the same old traditional multilateral organizations in the same way they were doing. And finally, the question of complexity. Bilateralism is always there. Even in ASEAN, ASEAN is a multilateral organization, but security cooperation for a long time, even to this day, is mainly bilateral. That was the compromise at the Bali meeting, Bali summit in '76, that ASEAN should not do military cooperation, but will encourage and accept bilateral cooperation. But ASEAN will do multilateral diplomatic cooperation. So President Trump is a transactionalist. He believes in bilateral more than multilateral. But let's see how long he is going to be in power. I think there is plenty of support for multilateralism in the US. The majority of Americans support the UN, majority. This is according to opinion polls. So I don't think it's going to disappear. But I think that my whole basic point is this multiplexity is going to be much more diverse than the singular systems we have seen.
Professor.
Cold War or the unipolar moment. So we'll have regional actors, non-state actors, we'll have corporations and foundations, as well as emerging powers and established powers and submerging powers.
Okay. Thank you. Professor, I may have to cut you there to give perhaps other members of the panel to respond. I've been told by the organizing committee we may have to speed up. So what do you think about these compliance to international agreements? How important are they now?
Thank you. About the question of compliance, I think that we have to take into considerations three different things. I think that the first thing is that, in fact, with the unraveling of quite all the political international organizations, and I mean political international organizations, not technical international organizations like World Bank, UNDP, WHO, etc. We have a new responsibility coming from the states. I think the states are coming again, the most powerful actors on the world stage, could be for the worst or for the best, for many different reasons. And I think that we must not be too confident towards the international organizations to compel states to comply with the rule of law. It means very concretely that we must have some states, like the US, after Trump presidency maybe, like France, like the UK, like Germany, like Indonesia, like Japan, like South Korea, etc., who have to take their responsibility through a policy, for instance, of sanctions, of naming and shaming. And I think if we consider that the international organizations can do the work for us instead of the states, and that we will blame, for instance, the UN, and the UN Security Council, oh, that's a very bad organization, it was not able to prevent the conflict, to stop the war, etc. It will lead nowhere. All responsibility is at stake. And when we have very strong violation of human rights, we have some principles, we have the R2P, responsibility to protect. And that's why I think there was an historical moment in which we failed. And this moment was not about China, it was about Syria. It was 2013, when the US decided, and then the EU did also, in fact, not to take actions against Assad regime in Syria. If we had taken action, we would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Hundreds of thousands of lives. If we had taken action in Yemen, we would have saved also maybe dozens of thousands of lives. And I think we cannot remain silent. Exactly that we have to say is that all responsibility, and that also, the responsibility of the civil society also to push the state, to sanction the states if they are not complying with these rules. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Dr. Joseph, do you think ASEAN will be able to stand up against new rising bullies? I'm rephrasing your word.
I think the South China Sea is a clear example of the limitations of rules and institutions. I mean, let's face it, right? The Chinese have done things and gotten away with things, and in all likelihood will probably continue to do so. Which is why it is important that while we pursue rules of the game, while we pursue multilateral efforts, we also need to still have in the case of the South China Sea, the United States playing a major role in terms of its presence in the region. Okay. Very quickly on the question of the development, just two quick points. The first is, globalization. People tend to blame globalization for the disparities in wealth. Now, the promise of globalization was to create wealth. Hopefully, it was never to distribute wealth. The wealth distribution is a policy issue. Okay, let's be clear about that. It's a policy issue for governments. Some have done it obviously better than others. Which leads me to the second point about rich countries being richer and the developing countries struggling to catch up. Which is why I think it is very important for developing countries to try to work together and to cooperate. ASEAN being the best, if imperfect, example of that.
Okay, Kotaro, what do you think about minimizing the gap between the poor and the rich?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Allow me to answer. So the quick answer is manufacturing. So if you take a look at the path taken by the US, Europe, then Japan, then Korea, Taiwan, so-called Asian tigers, then China is following. And ASEAN used to be the most promising place in the world, like after the World War II. That's why ADB headquartered in Manila. Why Manila? Because Philippines used to be the most promising country in Asia, whole Asia. Because Japan was totally destroyed, China was there, destroyed as well, and Korean Peninsula was disaster. But Southeast Asia, of course, there's some damages, but still people speaking English and resources, and then so many opportunities. But why not? Because Southeast Asian countries, ASEANs, cannot grow manufacturing. Can you think of any global plant in manufacturing done by Southeast Asian countries? Not yet. Maybe tiger beer only. So, most important thing is growing manufacturing industries into the level 20 to 30% of the output GDP-wise, and employment 20-30% of the population. So every other countries, other than ASEAN countries, so-called Asian tigers and Western nations, including Japan, achieve that. So rich people in Southeast Asia is investing basically still real estate and resources. They are not investing fostering manufacturing. So that's the most important thing. Without manufacturing, even Singapore is a city state, but 25% of their GDP is coming from manufacturing. So fostering manufacturing by the government and investment to the manufacturing by the billionaires and the successful families is needed. Without manufacturing, you cannot break up the so-called middle income trap.
Right. Please join me in thanking all the panels. I guess one of the conclusion of our session today is the world is changing. It's growing more complex. Hope has not died yet, I hope. I believe that is the message. There will be new players, new actors, new configurations, new setups. And if I may quote Madame Lagarde in the last week's World Bank IMF annual meeting, she said that we will witness the rise of a new multilateralism, and we hope that will be the one where everyone will benefit equally. With that, thank you so much. Again, thank you to the amazing panel. Thank you to the participants.